Hello, hello. Thank you all for joining us. It's a delight to be here back with one of my favorite philosophers who I've read very closely for many years, Professor Kwame Appiah. Thank you so much for taking this time. He is, if you're not familiar with the professor's work, he is a professor of philosophy and law at NYU. His most recent book, The Lies That Bind, Rethinking Identity. Thank you so much for taking time to talk today.
It's a pleasure.
So to start, as you have surely heard, in Ghana, the LGBTQ community is once again under attack, where just in the last few days, 21 people from that community were arrested by security forces for attending a conference. As you also know, that Ghana outlaws same-sex relationships, and the country's penal code prescribes between 3 and 25 years in prison for any citizen found to be in a same-sex relationship. So being that you are not only a Ghanaian British philosopher, but also identified as gay when you were growing up in Ghana and have written about that, how can you help us understand this situation, what's happening in Ghanaian culture?
Yes, well, it's obviously very, very disturbing. But the easiest way to understand what's going on is to see it in a slightly longer historical context.
Yeah.
So that law you mentioned is a British colonial law, and it's roughly the same as the law that governs, that proscribes gay sex in many former British colonies. As in many former British colonies, sometimes the government takes it seriously, and sometimes they don't. And so you have to look at more than what's on the books. And as you can imagine, and as it's not too hard to figure out, when you have a law like that on the books, it's most likely to be used against low status people or people who don't have lawyers and defenses and so on. And that's true in Ghana as well. But when I was growing up, I'd have said that you didn't really have to think about this law very much. Of course, you couldn't have sex in public if you were gay, but you couldn't have sex in public if you were straight either. People didn't think of sex as something that was anybody else's business. And my father, who was an elder of the Methodist Church of Ghana, his view about my sexuality was that it was sad that I couldn't appreciate the pleasures of sex with women. That was his main preoccupation, was that I was denying myself something that he thought was obviously enjoyable. He didn't think there was anything wrong with sex with men, really, because after all, sex is enjoyable and it's probably enjoyable with men too. But what he was sad about was that I was going to miss out on this thing that he thought was a source of pleasure. So he was not, in other words, he was deeply unmoralistic about it, even though, of course, being an educated man and a lawyer, he knew it was illegal. And he knew he'd read Leviticus, so and St. Paul. So I would have said, I wouldn't have told anybody. I wouldn't have said I was gay, and I didn't go around making a big deal about it. But my parents knew, and I wasn't worried about anything happening to me. Over the last 50 years, one of the things that has changed in Africa, in Anglophone Africa especially, but in Africa more generally, is that a concerted campaign led by evangelical American Christians to persuade the world that the only view of Christianity that's acceptable is their view, in which, for some reason, they've become extremely obsessed with questions about homosexuality, has meant that increasingly Christians, and especially evangelical or Pentecostal Christians in Ghana, are quite homophobic in what they say. It's a bit hard to decide what people actually think, because in those very same churches, they also preach a great deal. They're somewhat sex obsessed, I have to say. And so they preach a great deal against, for example, adultery as well. But the practice in Ghana is not one in which people who engage in adultery are regarded very badly. So I don't know how seriously most people take it, but what they do know is that they're supposed to take it seriously in these churches. At the same time, in a country which also has a quarter of its population or so, perhaps more, Muslim, again, Wahhabi influenced Muslims, for whom this is also, for some reason, an obsession, have had big influence in Ghana too. When I was growing up in my hometown in Kumasi, which is the second city of Ghana, you didn't see women in, you didn't see veiled women. Now you do. So there's been a shift in Islam as well. So the result of all this is that this topic, which was really not very interesting when I was growing up, has become a big topic. And now members of the government, if they're asked about it, if they want to be re-elected, have to say that they think it's very, very terrible. Now, I'm not going to out anyone, and so I'm not going to out straight members of the Ghanaian elite who happen, in my knowledge, to be quite non-homophobic, because they all have to pretend to be. But I can tell you that I have been in meetings with people, including, for example, former presidents of Ghana, where it was perfectly clear that they didn't care about this at all personally. But they have to care about it because it's become this big political issue, and newspapers go on about it. So it's against that background that this sort of thing, I think, has to be interpreted. I assume that the meeting these people went to was a gay rights meeting. You might think that a constitution that protects freedom of expression would allow people at least to discuss gay rights, that it shouldn't be a crime to do that. And maybe these people will end up not being charged with anything, but they will have been locked up and probably abused while in detention. And if the government of Ghana were genuinely interested in protecting the welfare of its citizens, they would, of course, have ordered these people, these cops, to stop.
What does pre-Christian African homophobia look like differently from a Christian influenced Africa?
Well, so one of the themes of my work has been that Africa is very diverse. When Speke and Burton, who were the two British men who first explored East Africa, arrived in Buganda, it was a well-known fact that the king of Buganda was set with young men about the palace, and he was the king. So there wasn't that much anybody could do about it, and they didn't really want to do very much about it. So I think the answer is, I would say that the most important thing is that, especially in small societies, people wouldn't have talked about anything. I mean, you don't talk about sex with other people. And so even if people were engaging in same-sex relations, it would not have occurred to them to turn it into a social identity and to make claims about it. In most places, I think. I remember talking once to a young man who came from somewhere on the Senegal River in Senegambia. I think he was from Gambia. And he said he grew up in a small village. He realized when he was around about puberty that he was looking at other boys in a way that they weren't looking at him. And he said, the only thing I knew was I shouldn't talk about it. I didn't know, I didn't have a name for it. There was no word in our language for this, but I knew I shouldn't tell anybody. So I think the answer is that probably in many places there wasn't very much. In some places there was something, and that the main thing would have been that it would have been very hard to find conversations about this sort of thing, because, well, as my English grandmother would have said, what kind of civilized person spends a lot of time talking about sex with a, so I think, I mean, there's anthropologists who looked into this, and there are accounts of Evans Pritchard is one of the most famous African anthropologists, has an account of sex between men and boys among the Azandi and so on. So there are pre-colonial accounts, but on the whole, I think the difficulty is that, particularly because the first people who came to ask these questions tended to be associated with Christianity, and it was known that Christians were against anything except having one wife and sex with her and nothing else. I think it would have been hard for them to figure stuff out. So my guess is, but I think the evidence is a bit thin, my guess is not very much, and certainly nothing as organized as what you might call homophobia. There would have been, frankly, I think the most likely thing that would have happened to people who were found having, men who were found having sex with one another, or women who were found having sex with one another, would have been to interpret it as through the lens of something like witchcraft, because anything weird and unusual would have been interpreted through the lens of something like witchcraft. Mm. So because they wouldn't have had the idea that there was we have to remember that our idea of a homosexual was invented in the 19th century. It's the idea of a kind of person who prefers sex with their own sex, right? That's a very specific way of thinking about homosexuality. The Romans and the Greeks didn't think about it like that. For the Romans and the Greeks, you had sex with people. Sometimes they were men, sometimes they were women. But and so there was an activity of having sex with another man, but it wasn't being someone who had sex with another man wasn't really a kind of person. We've, through essentially in Europe in the 19th century, we invented this way of thinking in which if a man wanted to have sex with another man or a woman with another woman, they were a new kind of person. And the word homosexual was invented for that as a sort of medical word. But, you know, so I suspect that, for example, Mutesa, I think that was his name, the Ugandan king, I'm sure he didn't think of himself as a kind of person because he had sex with the boys in his household. I'm sure he had sex with women too. He certainly did because he had descendants. But so anyway, I think you have to think of it against that background. We're so used to the idea, our idea, that this is a kind of person, and we read it back. I mean, you and I may or may not agree about this, but I think people read it back into the Torah. I don't think the Torah says anything about homosexuals. What it says is about sleeping with a man.
Oh, 100%. It's an action, not an identity. 100%.
Yeah. So,
100%.
and that makes a difference to how things go.
Oh, you know? Absolutely. I completely agree. Yeah. Thank you so much for that. So you know, you're such a rare gift. I mean, I read your work, but the fact that I can ask you a question like this also, knowing Ghanaian intellectual history, what are some of the interesting new trends emerging in from philosophers in Ghana, and how, if at all, is that work affecting government, civil society, you know, culture in Ghana?
So let me say an important thing, which is that in the last year, a number of Ghanaian intellectuals, so far as I know, all of them identified as straight, have spoken out against the current government's homophobic policy. So there is, I'm not saying that the thing that the evangelicals and the Wahhabis have done is the only thing going on. Far from it. There's another powerful, thoughtful body of Ghanaians committed to life in Ghana. They're not people who live abroad, who are saying this is wrong. So that's a very important part of the current intellectual climate. There is an argument going on. It's not being taken for granted that this is the only way you can be. Ghana is a very religious country in the sense that there's almost nobody who denies the existence of God. Almost nobody. I mean, it's very rare. I once said to my father that I preferred the national anthem to the national hymn because the national anthem you could sing wholeheartedly without believing in God. And he said, what kind of advantage is that? There aren't any Ghanaians who don't believe in God. And he was more or less right. So having a kind of conversation in which it's not taken for granted that the mainstream church position is the only position you can have, that's a very big deal. And it's great. I celebrate these people, and some of them are very well-known people. I mean, one of them is the Ghanaian architect who built the who designed the African-American Museum in the Mall in Washington, and partners of UN officials and so on. He was a Ghanaian, so I think I would say, sorry, the risk I'm talking about is the risk of being seen as just another busybody foreigner coming in to tell us how to behave. I think what we can do more usefully is let the gay community in Ghana know that we're on their side and that they have friends and that they have people who respect them and don't think of them with contempt, and that and then ask them what they want us to do. And if they want us to shut up, we should shut up. But if they want us to do something, let's do it. Then let's see. But you know, because even organizing a meeting means you're going to be locked up, it's hard to ask the question, what does the Ghanaian, it's hard to speak of a community if you aren't allowed to organize, right?
So this is a really important point here. And, you know, when I spent the summer in Ghana working in some villages in the Volta region, we, one of the many projects we were involved with was empowering teens and early 20s and addressing the importance of condom use and breaking down HIV stigma. And they did it through putting on plays. And we understood that we shouldn't arrive with banners screaming our values, that we should empower them and support them and give them platforms. And, you know, and what you're saying here is this great balance, your work on cosmopolitanism and relativism, and on how we can hold both a respect for local culture and hold on to these sense of universal rights. And so picking up on this exact point you're touching on, that we should serve as allies by following the LGBT community in Ghana. But when they can't gather and fully communicate, in a case like that, should we leverage US power or influence against the Ghanaian government to create that change, assuming that's what they want? Or without knowing exactly what their request is, how do you propose as American activists we would respond? And also assuming the high majority of Ghanaian people, which I assume support the law, or at least a significant, then, you know, what does it mean as Americans to push on that majority in the favor of?
I mean, it's hard to say, I think, what most people at least thought about this before it became this fad among politicians to talk about it. As I say, my suspicion is that, except when they're sort of lectured about it by priests and imams, they, like most of us, we don't spend a lot of time thinking about other people's sex lives. It's not a really interesting thing to do. So I don't know. You could probably get different polls to tell you different things about what people think, and it'd be hard to interpret, and it'd be hard to tell how strongly they care about it. But look, these are the democratically elected representatives of the Ghanaian people. They may or may not be representing the views of those people, but they're their representatives. I think, you know, in terms of our dealings with them, what we have to say to them is, we disagree with you about this, and we think this is a serious matter. That we think you're getting this seriously wrong. Of course, we understand that you disagree with us about that and many other things, and we respect you. I mean, this is a dialogue among people who respect one another. The Ghanaian leadership is very good on many things, and for example, Ghana is way less sexist than many countries and cultures in the world, especially actually in the south and in the Ewe part of the country and the Akan part of the country that you visited. I mean, the Ewe part was what you visited. So, so I would say I mean, it's not as if they don't know that what you think and what I think. They know that perfectly well. The current president of Ghana is a distinguished international lawyer, educated at British boarding schools. I once met him at the White House when he was Minister of Foreign Affairs under President Bush, I think. So he's perfectly aware of what this all is, and so were his predecessors, at least the last two, both of whom like him, I have met. So I could, so I think they know, but I think on the other hand, they probably don't know. They don't think there's anything much they can do about it. They're in the position, I suspect, of many contemporary Republican politicians who are perfectly clear that Joseph Biden won the last election, but know that they will get into trouble with lots of their followers if they say that. And so the question is it worth it to them to try and lead as opposed to follow? That's always a challenge in democracies. Getting politicians to lead as opposed to follow is difficult because politicians who do too much leading usually get kicked out. So I don't know how to persuade them that it's worthwhile to do something about this, but they have a lot of power. Politicians in a place like Ghana, the Minister of Home Affairs could, if he wanted, simply tell the police to stop this. But the thing is, if he did that, somebody would say that he'd done that. And then the newspapers would say, probably they would say that he was secretly gay. That's what they normally say when someone says anything friendly to gay people. And of course, I don't know if it's a man or a woman at the moment, but he or she would then, of course, have to go around denying that they were gay, and they would be distracted from the business of doing their job. So I have sympathy with the people who are faced with this problem, but I think we should be clear to them that we do think that they have a responsibility to bring their country into compliance with human rights norms, and that locking people up for being something is a violation of human rights norms, and furthermore, that we think they shouldn't be locked up for doing certain things that they want to lock them up for. I think we should just have this conversation. I mean, I want to have that conversation because I want them to be able to tell us what they think we are doing wrong.
Yes.
I want them to be able to tell us why there was a big Black Lives Matter demonstration in Accra, in a country where, whatever you can think about the police, they're not anti-Black racist, and so on. So I think we should have these conversations, and we should be clear about where we are. But it's very difficult to. I don't know what we can. You shouldn't exaggerate the power of democratic politicians to push their culture. And that's why I think these statements by these figures who are not politicians, writers, architects, other kinds of intellectuals, are useful, because they don't have to go along with the crowd. They're not. They don't need to be supported by the populace, and nobody really. It may be that nobody cares a lot what they think, but I think hearing over and over again people that you otherwise respect saying this is wrong, and then, you know, to the extent that we can allow the conversation to occur, then we can have the conversations that have occurred in your religious tradition and in the ones that I was growing up in, which have allowed people to see that there are other ways of thinking about this that are deeply consistent, in my view, with Christianity. I'm sure with yours. In yours with Jewish tradition, and by the way, I think this is true. This is true of Islam, though it's harder. It's more dangerous at the moment in the world today to speak out as a Muslim dissident than it is to speak out as a Christian or a Jewish dissident, probably. But you can read some of the greatest literature of the Muslim world was written by is love poetry written to men, by men, and whatever that means, it means that there have been places and times when Islam was functionally tolerant of homosexuality.
So, so one last question for you today, and this has been so informative as always. Given your work on identity, and again, friends, the professor's most recent work, "The Lies That Bind: Rethinking Identity," please check that out. You know, there is a social war, if you will, today on what people call identity politics, and people mean very different things by that. But I think most commonly meant is that people of a certain racial or gender identity should be prioritized in political positions. And I think what the far left usually means is minorities, in particular Black folks or brown folks. I don't think they mean Jews or Asians, but Black folks or brown folks. And I think what the far right means is white folks, and also, of course, on the side of gender as well. And I wonder what you think of that approach. Of what do you think the relationship should be to identity, racial and gender, and the empowerment to govern?
We come to civic life as trans people and cis people, straight people, gay people, brown people, white people, Black people, red people, yellow people, Jews and Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, Hindus. And as it were, that's truly what we are. I mean, it's really important to me that I'm a man. It's not just a contingent fact about me, a fact that doesn't make any difference to how I think about anything. It's an important fact that I'm not white, and so on. So of course, that will affect how I interact. But the particular combination of identities I have is actually quite rare. And so I can't make a politics if I insist that everybody in my politics be an American citizen of Anglo-Ghanaian extraction who's gay and post-Christian, and married to a Jew. That won't get me a party. So we better not try to build our parties around intersection, around sort of trying to find the group that you have most identities in common with. Now, I didn't mention class, partly because it takes a lot of conversation to persuade many Americans to think the class is really interesting and important. But partly because in this context, people tend not to think of class as a kind of identity. And when they're opposing identity politics, especially from the left, what they want instead is class politics, which is just another kind of identity politics, only it's the kind of identity politics they're in favor of. Now, I think it's a bad idea to be against identities in politics or for identities in politics. What you should be in favor of is intelligent and sensitive use of your identity to make links with people in order to do the thing that politics is about, which is running the society together. And to do that, I have to do it in the end with everybody. I can't, we have, in our system, majorities, get to decide things in many contexts, though in some contexts we have super majorities, and in other contexts, some of the rights in our constitution, a majority can't change at all. They're just built into the constitution. But still, even the things which are supposed to be decided by majority, I think the right way to think about them is that when the majority is deciding what to do, it should take into account what the minority wants. It should think, yeah, we can win on this, that is, get everything we want, but we could also win less, but accommodate the other side. This is what has worked in abortion politics in Europe. Abortion politics in Europe is incredibly complicated and messy, but in the end, a woman who needs an abortion can get one, but she may have to go through some hoops to get there. Now, I'm sort of against the hoops. I think it's the way I think about it. It's up to her. But that's what a democracy produces. If people are attentive to the views of others, they'll try and cobble together a set of rules that everybody can feel good enough about, rather than a set of rules that some majority feels great about and the minority is skulking around feeling oppressed. So in that process, acknowledging people's identities is important, but not refusing to work with people of other identities, or making your identity the only thing that you think matters. So I think racism is obviously a big issue in American politics. It's a stain on our long history, and we ought to do something about it. And I think white people and black people and brown people and yellow people ought to agree about that. And then they ought to recognize that they have different things to do, because the way in which white people can be helpful in dealing with racism is just different from the way in which brown and black people can be. It's not our choice. You didn't choose to be a white person faced with a racist society, and I didn't choose to be a brown person faced with a racist society, but there we are. And I think in those contexts, we can often use our identities in an affirmative way. To speak as a white person against racism is a kind of special gift, which I don't have. I can't do that. And you can do that, and you do. And that's part of your contribution to our politics. So I think, as I say, I think you shouldn't be against identity, you shouldn't be for identity. You should accept that people have identities, accept that they can lead them astray, and that then we need to pull them back, but that also they can get them to do great things. I mean, how could you make Israel without Jewish identity? Tell me that. And this is not, in my view, the week to celebrate everything about Israel, but that a country was put together over a relatively short period of time, a modern nation, has something to do with the power of identity, and much of that is good. When the British created the modern welfare state, they created it for each other. They needed British identity to do that, right? In the 1945 Labour government, they had to say, we're doing it for each other. They had to care about each other. You can't care about other English or British or Scots, Welsh, Irish people unless you think of yourself as English, Scotch, Welsh, Irish, and think of them as English, Scotch, Welsh, Irish. And we did a great thing when we passed the Civil War amendments, we Americans, something we can be proud of. We changed the direction of a society that was built as a slave society and repudiated slavery. I don't see how you can take pride in that unless you think of yourself as an American. That's identity politics. It's good identity politics. What's wrong with that? How can anyone? Now, of course, American nationalism can lead you astray as well. That's my point. So don't ask, is it identity politics or is it not identity politics? Ask, is it good politics? Is it leading in a good direction? And are we using identities for good or for evil? That's my thought.
Amazing, amazing. Thank you so much, Professor Kwame Appiah. I always love learning from you, and I hope others will continue to read his columns and his books. And we're very grateful for your time. Thank you so much for this, and wishing you so much continued success.
Yeah, thank you for getting in touch, because this is the story you started with is an important topic.